let me just tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm talking to you from a very grey Huddersfield in West Yorkshire, but Pace, where I work, is based in Leeds. And I am a youth and community worker by background, and I've worked for about 20 years, mainly in the field of violence against women and girls, but since 2005 in the field of child sexual exploitation. Can you see that okay? Or is it really?
Yeah, lovely. Yeah, it's perfect.
You've got the main slide up, yeah?
Yep.
Beautiful. Right.
Good start.
Bigger. Okay, fantastic. So yeah, so youth and community worker, and I worked, bizarrely, it's funny how life works out, at Pace pre-2010 with parents, and we worked in areas like Rochdale, Rotherham, Huddersfield, where I live, all over the place around child sexual exploitation. And then I left and worked for Women's Aid with women who'd been internationally trafficked and sexually exploited. Then I went on to do my academic research, which explored how social workers understand child sexual exploitation. I was particularly interested in how they understood choice making and agency of sexually exploited girls. And the need to separate out choice and blame. My particular area of interest is victim blaming, how we understand the agency of young people who are being exploited. And my other huge passion, as you're going to see, is the beautiful, wonderful contextual safeguarding approach. So after I finished my studies, I went and worked in South Yorkshire in a multi-agency CSE and CCE team as a trainer and an evaluator. I've been back at Pace for 16 months because it's just the best place to work in the world. I hope my boss is on. And I work there as a trainer and a research consultant. So yeah, so it's kind of, yeah, dipped in and out, but back at Pace at the moment. Can everyone see the presentation? Is that okay?
I can see it fine, yeah. Can anybody else see it? Are we all good?
Okay.
Yes, we can see it all right.
Brilliant, yeah. Fantastic, fantastic. So I also work freelance as a trainer for the Contextual Safeguarding Network. And I'm going to put myself on the line here and be honest with you, I'm a super fan of contextual safeguarding. And hopefully, I mean, wherever you are at in your journey with contextual safeguarding, I'm not desperately familiar with Darlington, although I have visited on several occasions and it's just beautiful. So it's lovely to be talking with you. But yeah, wherever you're at, just think about how what I'm talking about aligns with your practices or doesn't align or could align. You know, across the country, people are at really different stages with this. It's very much a work in progress. So just take what you can. And really the aim of this hour that I've got with you, I hope, is that by the end of it, you feel really hopeful, that you feel enthused about this, because the work you're doing is tough. It's really, really tough. Really, really challenging. I don't think I've ever done a tougher job than working at Pace as a parent support worker. And we need hope. We need optimism, you know, and it can sometimes feel like we're just walking through mud. You know, and we had that report yesterday from the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, fresh off the press. It wasn't great. You know, it had some really concerning findings across the country. You know, and CSE may have died down in the press, but of course, those of us who are working with it, and of course, CCE know it hasn't gone anywhere. It's still a huge issue for a significant amount of young people. The response some young people are getting is still, in my opinion, not good enough. And, you know, we've got work to do. And to have contextual safeguarding, and I will be ever thankful to Professor Carleen Furman for creating this, is something hopeful. So if you get nothing else out of today, I hope that you feel, yeah, this is something, if we're not already on board with, or we're already on board with, that you feel, yeah, this is something we can really work with and we can make change. We can make change. So I'm going to just talk about the contextual safeguarding approach. I'm going to give a bit of a reminder about what it is. I'm going to share with you some lessons from the test pilot sites that are going on across the country, but are coming to an end this spring. I'm going to share a bit of research that's been done with young people. I'm going to talk about the importance of language, and I'm also going to talk about Pace's relational safeguarding model. That's the way that we work with parents and encourage other professionals to work with parents. And it very, very beautifully fits in with the contextual safeguarding approach. So Just to tell you a bit about PACE, I don't know if any of you have worked with PACE or heard of us before. We've been around 25 years now, and we were started back in the 1990s by the woman on the left, who was called Irene Iverson. Irene lived in South Yorkshire. She had 3 children, and one of those children was Fiona, who you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. When Fiona was 13 years old, she was targeted by males from outside the family who groomed her and sexually exploited her. During that time, Irene tried to get help. She tried to get Fiona safeguarded and just struggled at every turn. When Fiona was 17 years old, she was made to go and sell sex on the streets in Doncaster. And 3 weeks after she was first put on the streets by the offenders, she was murdered by a man who was trying to buy sex from her. Now, the man who murdered her was charged, convicted, and given a life sentence. But the men who put her on the street, who were responsible for her being in that position in the first place, nothing happened to them. In fact, they were used as prosecution witnesses. So prosecutors used the men who'd exploited her to give evidence against the person who killed Fiona. And they sat in the courtroom along Irene Iverson. And as you can imagine, in the midst of her grief and her bewilderment, she just absolutely couldn't get her head around this at all. And as a result, she campaigned tirelessly to bring attention to these issues. She informed the Sexual Offences Act. She worked with other affected parents, and she set up what was then called CROP. And it shows how our language has evolved over that time. CROP stood for the Coalition for the Removal of Pimping. And very sadly, she died herself in the early 2000s, but her work continues to today. And when I started at what was then called CROP in 2005, there were like 3 of us, and now we've got a staff team of about 30. So what do we do? Well, we work with parents and carers who have a child who is at risk of or is being. And I love the way that you defined and thinking about the words risk and harm. I think we often put that term at risk very swiftly, where the risk has long passed, those young people are being harmed. But anyway, we work with parents who have a child who's being sexually or criminally exploited. And crucially, the offenders are external to the family. They're not within the family. They're external to the family. And we offer a great whole raft of training on this and advice to professionals about how to work with families. We've got a national parent support team that parents can self-refer into, whether it's CSE or CCE. And we have parents from all over the country who call in and receive telephone support sessions. And, you know, the staff we have are real specialists, real expert in this area, and yeah, provide kind of advocacy and emotional support. And then we also have co-located parent liaison officers. And these are, again, very specialist workers who work within multi-agency CE teams. And they are there for the parent. So as you'll know, there are often numerous professionals around the child, and rightly so. Often there's nobody there for the parent, or they might be offering someone who's helping them with their parenting. That's not what this is about. This is a worker who enables them to understand the MO of the perpetrators, to enable the parent to understand what a distorted perspective that perpetrator creates within the child's mind, to help that parent understand their own trauma, their child's trauma. And as I say, what I said before, that encouraging them, supporting them to be able to keep that porch light on and increase the safeguarding of their child. And I'm doing an evaluation of that work at the moment. And my police colleagues tell me that they wouldn't know half the information that they did if it wasn't for that relationship between the PLO and the parent. Parents can be an absolute phenomenal source of information that can go on to be used as intelligence. And because the PLO is independent, they're not statutory, it creates a trust that is really extraordinary, and they become a real bridge or a conduit between parents and police and social care, which is really important. We have a volunteer service, we have parent network days and weekends, we have an online parent forum, we do training on loads of different subjects that you're more than welcome to look at. And then we have a big strand of our work, which is parent participation. We work with some wonderful parents who come to our training, deliver on our training, who are involved in consultation, in policy making. They direct everything that we do. So lots of that going on. So you may, oh, I've just seen a question. Yes, parents can access such support. You are more than welcome to give them our phone number or contact details, and they can contact our National Parent Support Team. We have a PLO in North Yorkshire. I don't know if that covers your area. My geography is terrible, but we have one in North Yorkshire. Yeah. So you'll all have heard of contextual safeguarding, excuse me, but you probably haven't heard of the relational safeguarding model. So over our 25 years, we've worked with thousands of parents, and we wanted to try and find a way of articulating what it is we're trying to do and what it is we really want to encourage other professionals to do when working with parents. And the conclusion that we came to some time ago is the recognition that our current child protection, it wasn't set up to respond to extrafamilial harm. It wasn't really set up to respond to adolescence. It was solely designed to respond to intrafamilial harm perpetrated within the home with the family, maybe to mainly to younger children. So what happens when a referral is made in for extrafamilial harm is that very often the focus is on the parenting and the child's behaviour rather than what is going on in the locations outside the home and the offenders. And what that means is that that focus on the parenting and the child's behaviour really implies to the parent quite explicitly that this is your fault. If you parented differently, if you parented differently, then your child wouldn't be vulnerable to exploitation. If you change this, if you do this, if your child's behaviour changes, then they won't be vulnerable to exploitation, or they wouldn't have been vulnerable to exploitation, and so forth. And for parents where the harm's coming from outside the home, this is just absolutely devastating for them. You've got a child who's being raped, going missing, and so on, and services come in line with their systems. This is not a criticism of individuals, this is the system, and say to them essentially, this is your fault. By implication, overtly or covertly, it is really, really tough. Now, what we've been trying to do in this country for a very long time, it's changing, but we're still doing it, is put a square peg in a round hole. The square peg of our current child protection system into the round hole of extrafamilial harm, and they don't fit. I think about a family, a mum I used to work with, and this is a bit graphic, so just what Sarah said about self-care, just please bear that in mind. She had a 15-year-old daughter. The 15-year-old daughter had been being sexually exploited by familial males for a number of months. Having regular strategy meetings, social worker trying to get her to engage with her and couldn't. And we had a strap meeting booked for Monday morning. Sunday night, the aunt of this young woman brought her home in her car, and there was blood all over the back seat. And it turned out that this young woman had once again been very violently anally raped by a number of men. And as she often did, this young woman went into her mother's bedroom, lay in the fetal position and didn't move for 18 hours. Monday morning comes round, all of us professionals turn up at the meeting. Of course, the young person didn't, she was in too much pain and the mother was looking after her. And we all sat around the room and agreed that this young person was at risk of death. That was what was agreed. I remember it as clear as day. And the outcome of that meeting was, well, we'll meet again in a month and we'll try and engage this young person meanwhile. And I remember sitting there scratching my head thinking, yeah, this is not good. This is really not good. And this was replicated all around the country at the time. And what I realise now, mainly because of Professor Furman's work, is it was because we were trying to fit the square peg of our intrafamilial child protection system into the round hole of extrafamilial harm. And I'm afraid to say, as a result of that, we really let that young woman down. We really let her down. And 10 years later, I see her sometimes in town with her mum. It's not in a good way. And that is why I'm so passionate about contextual safeguarding, because we want to match that peg with that hole and more effectively safeguard young people from harm. So really briefly, relational safeguarding model's got three basic principles. So firstly, unless proven otherwise, so unless proven that the parent doesn't have the capacity to safeguard their child, then parents should be included as key safeguarding partners. Now, I caveat that a bit when I say unless proven otherwise, because what we often find is that parents may be deemed to not have the capacity to be involved. They may be seen as not engaging, as being difficult, and so on. And actually, when you dig a bit deeper, they're not happy to engage because they feel unsafe. They're worried their child will be removed or criminalised. They may have had a poor experience of services before. And sometimes with the right support, they will engage. They do want to safeguard their child, but there can be a few barriers. So that parent has a place at the table. They get invited to meetings, they get given notes, they are asked their opinion, because let's not forget, where do the majority of children who are being exploited by extrafamilial people live in this country? They live in the family home. Disproportionate amount in the care system, we know that, but the majority are at home. And parents can be a key partner in this. But alongside that, their own trauma needs to be recognised and understood. So if we at Pace, like I said, we work really hard with parents to help them, almost give them permission to say, yeah, this is awful. This is so traumatic. It's okay to feel like that. It's okay to feel that you want to go and throw a brick at these offenders, or you want to throw a brick at your child because they're just driving you up the wall. We try and validate those feelings they have and make them feel safe about expressing them. So that's the first principle, partners and recognising their needs. Secondly, formulating robust safeguarding plans that address the extrafamilial risk and have accountability for all. So when we're putting that safeguarding plan together, we're looking at where the harm is coming from. We're looking at the locations where it's happening. We're looking at the offenders. And I cannot overemphasize how much information parents can have about the offenders and the locations, the access they have to the child's social media, phone numbers, the names of other young people, the names of the offenders, the houses they're living at, the streets they're on. It is astonishing, absolutely astonishing. A police intelligence officer said to me, couldn't do this job without the PLO, because I get so much information from her. But that plan needs to address where that harm's coming from. It's not rocket science, is it? I know, but this is what we're trying to really advocate for. And then thirdly, that information that we gain from parents and others is used to disrupt the offenders. So disrupt. We don't want to displace these offenders. We don't want to move them on. We want to disrupt them. And I'm sure you have fantastic police working in your area. We work with the police a lot. My colleague used to run one of the first multi-agency CSE teams in the country. There are a multitude of tools, orders, legislation that can be used to disrupt these perpetrators. They just have to be known about, they have to be followed up on. And of course, so much of that is about multi-agency working, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, all of these features completely fit in with the contextual safeguarding approach, as I'm going to go on to say. So that's the relational safeguarding models. Just hold that in a corner of your mind for a minute and we'll come back to it. So contextual safeguarding, forgive me if you know all this, but I'm going to do a reminder just in case you don't, or just to refresh your memory. So as I said, it was founded by the amazing Colleen Furman, who is now at the University of Durham, just very near you. She recently did her inaugural, I can never say that word, professor lecture, which I really commend to you. Amazing speech about contextual safeguarding. It's where it's up to. And she wrote a book, which I usually have with me, but it's downstairs, called Rewriting the Rules of Child Protection. She published this in 2020, and that phrase, rewriting the rules of child protection, is in no way overstating what the contextual safeguarding approach is trying to do. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. We're talking about really moving, what's a really heavy container ship, moving a container ship right around. And that takes time. It takes effort, it takes energy, it takes research, it needs to be evidence-based. But that's what contextual safeguarding is trying to do, rewrite the rules of child protection. Because as I've said already, and she so clearly and articulately puts when she's speaking, our child protection system was not set up to respond to extrafamilial harm. And Chris has already given you the definition of contextual safeguarding, so I won't go over it again. But it's this approach, this understanding to significant harm that happens outside the home. Just a little brief history of contextual safeguarding. I'm not going to read through all of this because we'll be here all night, but I just want to tell you where it started. Colleen Furman was asked to review 9 cases of peer-on-peer abuse back in 2011. And this involved 145 young people. There's two cases that really stand out to me. So she talks about a case she looked at of a boy, a teenage boy, who was always late for school, always late for school. Whenever he was in school, he'd only use the toilet in lesson time. And this was really getting annoying and frustrating, and people were like, oh, this is so disruptive. And it went on and on and on. And in the end, he was referred into children's social care. And in line with their systems and their policies, children's social care went and looked at his family and his home. And what they found was that he had a sister with disabilities. So they put in a bit of support for the sister and the parents, and that didn't make any difference. He still came to school late. He still used the toilet when he shouldn't have done. And in the end, because this didn't change, they put in fines. They said, look, parents, if you don't get this kid into school on time, we're going to fine you. And you know what? That worked. That worked. So he got to school on time. He used the toilet when he was supposed to. A few weeks later, however, he disclosed that he was being sexually and physically assaulted in his community, and that was also happening, guess where, in the school toilets. So to all intents and purposes, it looked like this was a successful outcome. He was on school on time, he was in the toilets when he was supposed to, but actually that intervention hadn't made him any more safe. In fact, it just made him less safe, because he had to get into the school when he didn't want to be, because he only wanted to be there when there was a teacher there, and he only had to use the toilets and so on and so forth. Nothing was looked at about the school context. Then she talks about a stairwell. Sorry, I thought I'd turn my phone's on. Let me turn that off. Then she looked at a stairwell. So a stairwell on a local estate where there were a rape happened. The rapist was charged. The person who'd been raped was relocated, and some other witnesses were as well. But when they look back 6 years later at that same stairwell, there were still rapes and sexual assaults happening, because nothing had changed about the context. And this really got Carleen Furman thinking about, well, how do we address, how do we focus on the context where harm is happening? And I'd really commend that book to you. It gives a real chronology of her journey on this. And she published the Contextual Safeguarding Framework in 2016. 2017, there were test pilot sites started to be rolled around the country. There's now 10 test pilot sites, 5 in London, 5 out of London, but they're coming to an end this spring. So there's going to be a huge amount of research that comes out post March, April of this year. That doesn't mean contextual safeguarding is going anywhere, far from it. But the evidence will be written up, the research will be written up, because one of the things I love about contextual safeguarding is it's not about academics in ivory towers going, here's another model, here's another paper you can read. It's a two-way dialogue between practitioners and academics. It's absolutely got evidence at its centre. It's evidence-based. So you've got researchers sitting at the front line in the case meetings with social workers and drawing on that information. So just keep your eye out for post-spring of a book that's coming out, research that's coming out, and so on, because things are really coming to the fore. Now, when we talk about contextual safeguarding and we talk about extrafamilial harm, and as Sarah said, people have different names for this around the country. We know that the majority of young people, thank goodness, aren't going to experience extrafamilial harm, but a significant minority will. And these are just some of the types of harm that we're talking about. So sexual exploitation, nothing new, is it? Sadly, been around since time began. Criminal exploitation, again, nothing new, but it's getting a huge amount of attention, as we all know at the moment. Our CE teams have all morphed together, haven't they? CSC and CCE. Youth violence, bullying, antisocial behaviour, radicalisation, intimate abusive teenage relationships. And within all of that is the real significance of peer relationships between young people. We know for adolescents that their peers can be far more important to them. Their opinion of them can be far more important to them than their parents, their siblings. It becomes really, really significant. Being excluded from a peer group can be absolutely devastating for a young person. So when we think about contextual safeguarding and all these types of extrafamilial harm, and this diagram is taken from the Contextual Safeguarding Network, just to make that clear. This is a diagram they use to illustrate the context children and young people are navigating. So with our normal traditional child protection system, children's social care focuses on the child and the home, as you can see at the bottom of that diagram. And what they're interested in when there's harm in the home is the parent's capacity to safeguard their child within that context. Fair enough, absolutely. But as young people get older and are navigating different social spaces and places, we have to think about, well, who has responsibility for safeguarding in these other contexts? I have an 11-year-old and a 17-year-old, and that 11-year-old has been pretty much glued to my side for the past 10 years. And rightly so. You know, she has recently started to walk to school on her own, and I let her, 'cause it's only a 5-minute walk with a knot in my stomach, but she's pushing back. She's pushing back. She's wanting that bit of independence. Adolescence is looming on the front. My 17-year-old, he's long gone. For a couple of years, 3-4 years now, he's wanted to go to football on his own, go to school on his own, hang out with his mates and so on. Totally normal, absolutely normal. But when children are little, if somebody wants to abuse them, and this is putting aside obviously the access abusers have through online, they generally have to go through a gatekeeper, a parent, a teacher, another adult. When young people enter adolescence and they're suddenly in these social spaces where there may not be a safe adult. So contextual safeguarding is saying, right, who has a reach into these contexts, who might have the capacity to be involved in the safeguarding of that child. So in a contextual safeguarding approach, safeguarding really does become everyone's responsibility. Now, this is the phrase we can throw out, isn't it? It's everyone's responsibility, a bit like multi-agency working and partnership working. It can become just something we say, and sometimes it doesn't mean very much. But in the contextual safeguarding approach, partnership working is absolutely central, and it's thinking about partnership working in a new way. So when you think about partnership working, you might think about health, education, children's social care, the police, youth justice, and so forth, and rightly so. Contextual safeguarding is saying, look, we need to broaden out who we think of as a safeguarding partner. It's interesting, there was a McDonald's in South Yorkshire, well, not one, all of them, where there were a lot of information coming in about concerns in McDonald's. This is a context where thousands of young people go through every day. Context that's open 24/7, you know, free Wi-Fi, relatively cheap, well lit, and so on. Lots of young people hanging out there, and lots of information was coming out about this context. And McDonald's, they told me never to talk about this, but I reckon they can take the hit. They didn't want anyone to know that there was a bit of an issue around these McDonald's. And I've got to be honest with you, every time we do training, McDonald's comes up. If they want to sue me, they can sue me, but I'm sure they won't. And they said, look, we don't want anyone to know we've got this issue, but we need to do some training on it. So we did some training with them about safeguarding the context of their McDonald's. Went in for an hour, told them what to look out for, who to call, where to go, what were the signs. And we trained the shift managers. But I remember thinking, oh, I wish we could train the cleaners. I wish we could train the people who clear up the tables, who get into those nooks and crannies. But what we're doing there is safeguarding a context where loads of young people hang out, where we know there's issues. It's a place of concern when other partners, such as social care, police and so on, of course they're not going to be there. But there are people who have a reach into these contexts who are there and can be involved in the safeguarding. If you look at this jigsaw on your screen, you'll see licensing is another one. There's lots of work going on with the nighttime economy. I'm not sure what it's like in your area, but I know in some areas now it's mandatory for taxi drivers to have safeguarding training, including training on CSC and CCE, because we know offenders may use taxi drivers to traffic young people around and about. Bus drivers, train drivers, those who operate CCTV, those who work in shopping centres, retail managers, door security, people who work in hotels, people who work in parks, people who run churches with those big areas around them where young people hang out, caretakers who monitor the school fields when kids go back to the school fields after school, people who clean the toilets. You name it, there are potential safeguarding partners everywhere. And within a contextual safeguarding approach, children's social care who would head up the contextual safeguarding approach will utilise these partners in the assessment of the context that they are concerned about and in the targeting of it. Yeah, licensed taxi drivers. So local authority licensed taxi drivers, in some areas it's now mandatory. There are private companies who are moving in that direction, but definitely across the country there's a real increase. I'm just looking at the chat, sorry, in licensed authorities. So another thing that is great about contextual safeguarding from PACE's point of view is it really recognises the changing relationship and the changing ability of parents to be a protective factor as their children go into adolescence. Can anyone tell me, just write in the chat or shout out, how do the United Nations define adolescence? What I mean by that is, what are the age parameters of adolescence? Does anybody know?
I reckon so, by just where people put in 14 to 16.
No, not quite.
Anybody else, any ideas in chat?
Go on, have a go. 10, yes, Sharon, absolutely. Starts at 10.
11 to 17.
Where does it end, do you think?
15 to 18, so we've got a 17 or an 18. I kind of feel
Yeah.
higher, lower, 12 to
Yeah.
18. 10 to 19. I feel like you're going to say it's lower.
You know
Sarah.
what? I'm going to say it's higher.
Oh, really?
So,
this is good.
Yeah, the United Nations define adolescence as being between the age of 10 and 25. So if you're on this call and you're 25, I hate to tell you this, but you're still an adolescent. Does anybody know why it might be 25? Any ideas?
Brain development.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about the brain development. Yeah. So recent, very clever neurologist types of people who understand the brain brilliantly have learned that actually our brain is still developing until we're 25. Amazing, isn't it? Still developing. And anyone know the last bit to develop in the old noggin up here? Anyone got any idea? What's the last bit to develop?
Is it the prefrontal cortex?
Yeah. And what does that do? What's going on in there?
Reasoning.
Yeah. And something else. Yeah.
I was going to say common sense, because sometimes I feel like some adults work with it, you've got no common sense.
Yeah. What does that bit of the brain regulate or try to regulate?
Emotions.
Yeah, beautiful. Exactly. Yeah, exactly, James. Yeah. So
that's why little people have a little fear. Absolutely. Thank you, James. Apparently Rihanna's in her last year of adolescence. Oh, Rihanna, that's terrible.
I've got 2 months left.
There you go. Make the most of it. I mean, it's on average. So what the UN say in their infinite wisdom is that adolescence physiologically, that shift, that change that is going on between 10 and 25 is more significant than at any time in your life. I mean, let's face it, 0 to 10 is pretty significant as well. But the changes that are going on are huge. And the contextual safeguarding approach, they really remind us of this, and they remind us of how challenging it can be for parents when they are parenting, caring for a child who's going through this. I mean, it explains a lot. My son burnt a pizza the other day. Well, you'd have thought the world had ended. And I'm constantly trying to remind myself he's not emotionally regulating, you know, be calm, take a deep breath, but it is challenging, isn't it? But there's a reason for it. Now, although parental control may lessen, like I was saying, your child may walk to school on their own, want to go out and hang out with their mates. It doesn't mean they can't be a protective factor. For some young people, not all, but for a good amount, who are being harmed by extra-familial people, home may be the safest place for them. But what Carleen Furman recognises in contextual safeguarding is that often places and spaces outside the home, they're just not safe for young people. But it's still home that is focused on by children's social care. Let me give you a little example. Just bear with me, watch my body language. So we've got Kim. Kim's 14 years old and she's being sexually exploited in a local park. She's going missing, she's being sexually assaulted, she's been given drugs. It's just, you know, really bad situation. She's referred in, rightly so, to children's social care. Now, what children's social care will do, in line with their policies and their procedures, and look at my body language, is go in to Kim's home. And they will look at what's going on in Kim's home. There may be problems, there may not be. Let's say there are. Let's say that Kim's mum's on her own. She's got 4 kids and she's got a drinking problem. So what Children's Social Care may do, in line with other agencies, and remember this is about systems, is say, right, Kim, we're going to perhaps refer you in for 10 sessions on healthy relationships and consent, probably 6. And mum, we're going to get her on a parenting course and give her some help for her substance misuse. Now, that might all work, sort out those issues in the families, it might not. But if it works or it doesn't work, look where my back is. My back is to the park over here, where actually Kim's still being sexually exploited, because that rarely seems to work. But even if she isn't being sexually exploited, other young people are being sexually exploited, and the offenders keep on offending. And so we go round and round and round. If we just take that individualised approach, where we just look at the parenting and we just look at the child's behaviour, and we don't look at where the harm is coming from and the offenders within those contexts, we'll all be sitting here in 20 years having the same conversations. So if you forget everything else from today, just remember that illustration. Contextual safeguarding is, yeah, looking at the child and the family and all of that, but broadening it out to look at the context where the harm is happening and trying to disrupt these offenders. And in turn, hopefully protecting and safeguarding tens, dozens, hundreds of young people, as well as hopefully that one individual. Now, another thing, you'll notice here I'm a big fan of this. As a former youth worker, I'm very passionate about youth work. Contextual safeguarding gets adolescents and it reminds us what is going on for that young person. As I said, it recognises the importance of peer relationships, but it recognises that the dynamics of adolescence are the perfect storm for the offender. I don't credit these offenders with any kind of psychological insight or understanding of the adolescent brain, but by George, they know how to use those beautiful dynamics of young people for their own benefit. Now, this is, we put the pictures in, but it's again taken from the Contextual Safeguarding Network. It is very normal for an adolescent to be motivated by risk and reward, very normal, but not to think long term. It's short term games. I'm going to go and drink 3 litres of cider on a park bench, and I'm not necessarily thinking I'm going to have a stinking hangover, my phone's going to be out of charge, my mum's going to be going out of her mind. A good example is GCSEs. You know, when you're desperately trying to get a child to revise for their GCSEs, and some will, some won't. I hate to universalise all young people, they're all different, but it is understandable if they cannot think about the future. If I work hard now, the consequence will be I'll be able to go on to further education if that's what I want to do, I'll get a better job, etc., etc. Their long-term consequential thinking just simply isn't in place in the way it will be when they're older. They also have this increasing desire for autonomy. They want to be treated like an adult. They want to look like an adult. They want their own phone, their own money, their own clothes to come in when they want to come in. And on top of that, as I've mentioned already, they're not able to emotionally regulate. So for the person who wants to exploit that, they'll say, come out and have a few drinks. I've got this empty house, coming back for a party. Don't worry about, you know, us being there till midnight and there's no buses. You'll be fine. What do you mean your mum says you can't come out? You're 14, you're nearly 15, you're an adult. And throw into that emotional regulating, you've got the perfect storm for the exploiter. And yet often we've blamed young people for these dynamics. Oh, why won't they come back when I tell them to? Why don't they think about the consequences of their action? Why does she keep going back to him? Why does he keep doing this? Why do they have to dress like that? We don't work very well with these dynamics, and we have to work better with them than the perpetrators do, because the offenders work with them brilliantly. And sadly, as I say, often we've blamed young people for those dynamics. So contextual safeguarding, I mean, we could talk about this all day, and I can, you know, if you want more extensive knowledge on this, do look at the Contextual Safeguarding Network, do look at our training. But when you think about contextual safeguarding, I think sometimes people would think, well, that's great. How on earth do we do this? Well, there's 4 guiding principles for contextual safeguarding. If you think of that park Kim was in, God, where do we start with this? Well, there's 4 things I want to identify. What's going to be the target of your intervention? Where are you concerned about? So if it's that part, the part would be your target, right? That's what we're worried about. That's the context we're going to target. Legislative framework. What legislation can we use within the context of that park? From police, social care, partnerships. which partners can we work with who have a reach into that park that can be involved in the safeguarding of that park, caretakers, people who run the cafe, whatever it may be, and outcome measures. Crucially, we want this to work, we want this to be successful, but how do we measure success? Well, is the risk in that park reduced? Is there a drop in reports of sexual assaults and drug dealing? Have there been arrests made, and so on? There's some fantastic videos about this on the Contextual Safeguarding Network that you can look at, but it's a great place to start if you feel like, yeah, that's a context we're concerned about. How can we address it? Now, as you'll know, contextual safeguarding was put into Working Together 2018, which was really significant. And what it means is we all have permission to use this approach, and it's an approach. It's not a model. We can use it kind of quite fluidly, but we have permission to use it. And it also works really well with signs of safety. The Contextual Safeguarding Network have put out a really helpful paper about how these things can work together. I remember doing training on signs of safety and thinking, I'm not sure how this is going to fit in with contextual safeguarding, but both teams behind those contextual safeguarding and signs of safety are working together to see how they can align their approaches. And in some test pilot sites, they are using both those approaches. So, relational safeguarding model, how it fits in with the contextual safeguarding approach. It's holistic, it absolutely challenges victim blaming, it encourages that parents lead on safeguarding, and it looks to where the actual problem is, as in the context where the harm is happening and the offenders within these contexts. And at PACE, we think it's really important to combine these two approaches. We did some research recently where we looked at, and actually this was cited yesterday in the independent inquiry into CSE, we looked at parents' experiences of children's social care when there was a referral of CSE. And overwhelmingly, the parents that we did the research with felt that they were treated as inadequate, that they were to blame, they didn't feel heard, they didn't feel consulted. They felt they were viewed as part of a problem that needed to be solved rather than part of a solution. Now, what this means is that focus on parental failure and the need for parental change means that the focus on the perpetrator can slip. So many resources going to the parents, changing the parenting, challenging the parenting, etc., that the perpetrators can sometimes just seem to be absented, which is really problematic. So parents told us that there's a real need for an attitudinal shift, improved understanding, see parents as an asset and work with them. And this has been evidenced in other pieces of research as well, that working with partners can be really so much more effective. And one parent said, and parents that we work with are really keen on contextual safeguarding, as you can imagine. And this parent said there needs to be a shift towards a model of contextual safeguarding where the risks are identified in different areas of the child's life and there's a coherent multi-agency response. So just for the last bit of time we've got together, I'm going to just talk through a few of the findings from the contextual safeguarding test pilot sites. What they've learned is that often local authority areas are working at level 1 or level 2. And you might recognise yourself within this. So if you're working at level 1, it means you've recognised that you need to adapt and change and you want to embed contextual safeguarding, but you're not really sure what to do. If you're at level 2, you're changing your systems and procedures. So you've kind of got to go through level 1 to get to level 2 for it to become a contextual safeguarding approach. And really, for a fully embedded contextual safeguarding approach to happen, for that massive container ship to fully move, for a local authority to say, yeah, we are a contextual safeguarding authority, there needs to be systemic change. Let me ask you a question. At the moment in Darlington, if you were to refer in a peer group or a park, would they be able to accommodate that referral? That's what we're talking about with systemic change. So you rang up your front door or whatever you call it and said, I've got a peer group of 16 young people I want to refer in as a peer group, not each individual, as a peer group. I've got a park I want to refer in. I've got the back of a churchyard I want to refer in. Would you be able to make that referral? The chances are you probably wouldn't at this stage, which is the norm across the country. But in some areas, they are moving in a direction. There's a place in Merseyside like this where they could accommodate that referral, and they've changed their assessment sheets completely so that they can take a contextual referral. Some areas are saying, look, we need to have social workers who just deal with contextual safeguarding and keep intrafamilial harm separate. People are working it in different ways, but to fully embed a contextual safeguarding approach, this is a direction that a local authority needs to be moving in. The other learning at lesson 1 has been this interplay and waiting. You're not going to be able to intervene in every single context where there's harm. It's just impossible. So what's come out of some of the test pilot sites is weighting up where the most significant harm is coming from. If you think about that example I gave at the beginning about the school and the boy going into school late and using the toilets when he shouldn't have done, if you were weighing up where the most significant harm was coming from, where would you think it would be? Well, I would say it was probably the school. Now, this isn't revolutionary, isn't it? The school, not the parents and the child, the school, the culture of the school. What are they doing to help safeguard this child? Were they asking the right questions? How could they ask the right questions? So the school would be your target, and then quite possibly need to be definitely some work done with the peer group, obviously, who are assaulting this young boy, and then family and neighbourhood. So context weighting and also interplay. So is there a peer group who you are concerned about who are causing trouble in a neighbourhood, but when that peer group's not in that neighbourhood, the neighbourhood's fine? So you want to really weight where the most significant concerns is, a concern is coming from, and so on. Now, level 2, so this is where it's been more embedded, systems and processes are changing. What people have done in these test sites is take this, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with it, the child and family assessment triangle that is commonly used, and they've adapted it. So look at this, peer group. People love a triangle, don't they? Love a triangle. And they've adapted these assessment triangles for all those contexts, peer group, school and neighbourhood. And you can access all of these. So supposing you are concerned about a peer group and you go, right, we want to assess generally what is going on in the dynamics of this peer group. So you want to look at the guardianship capacity. Who in that peer group or around that peer group has guardianship capacity or a caring investment? What are the emotional and family factors going on around this peer group, and how does this group function? Are there people in it who are really negative, people who have more power than the other? It just gives you a template of where to start. And there's these, as I say, there's these assessments for school and neighbourhood. So you're sitting in your school, you've got 15 people sitting around, and you take this assessment and think, right, we want to assess what is going on in this school. The other thing they encourage people to do in schools is surveys, questionnaires for young people, where they feel safe, where they don't feel safe, questionnaires for parents and so on. Massive part of contextual safeguarding. And again, it's something we trot out a lot, but it's so true, is listening to the voice of young people. Golly, we trot that out a lot, don't we? But they really mean it. Talking to young people, listening to them about their experiences. Mapping. I'm blasting it at you now. Mapping is really important as well. Some of you will be doing this. A lot of this, you might be thinking, well, we're doing this already, and that's fantastic. Often what I find is that contextual safeguarding has really been a way of pulling together stuff we've all known about for a long time, but it's pulled it together in this wonderful package to help us theorise and evidence what it is we've been doing for a long time. So in some areas of the country where they're embedding contextual safeguarding, they ask young people who may be being exploited or harmed outside the home, where do you feel safe? Suppose you've got a high street you're concerned about. Where do you feel safe on that high street? Where do you not feel safe? Who on that high street do you feel you could pop into and that would be a safe place? And what we find again is that often where adults and professionals think young people feel safe is not where they feel safe. So we must never assume we know what we know what they know, you know what I mean? We mustn't assume knowledge. So also what we do is get parents to fill in these maps as well and overlap the maps. Parents, I cannot emphasize this enough, the information they can give can be phenomenal. And we overlap the maps of the young person and the parents to see how much of that information can be used. And then when we map with young people, we map with parents, we don't just sort of stick it on a shelf. We need to show young people and parents that we're taking action on that. So if you do a survey in a school and young people tell you, well, we feel safe in the toilets, then the action needs to be taken on that. Well, what are you going to do about those toilets? How are you going to make them safer? This is an example, this is in Merseyside actually, of some mapping that we did in a park. And this is very simple. You could probably do this in very technological fancy way on a computer, but this is just a map of a park. Green represents where young people feel safe, amber where they feel kind of okay but got to keep their eyes open, red is where they don't feel safe. And as you can see, where do they feel safe? Near the cafe, near the main building. Where do they feel most unsafe? Out towards the canal, by the trees, where people can't see them. It can be a really useful exercise. Geographical mapping is important, and so is peer mapping. This diagram, I know it's very small. Again, this is taken from Carleen Furman's work. Now, peer mapping is something that people have been doing for a long time. I remember walking into Rotherham, into the charity there that worked with young people many years ago now. And all over the wall were flip charts full of information about offenders, about young people, car registers, phone numbers. It was extraordinary. Really, really important to do. It has its issues, but it's really important. But this map, again, was one that Carleen did from when she reviewed all the case studies. And you'll see at the centre is a young girl, 11 years old, who was being harmed, assaulted, raped by all the men in blue at the top. You can see there's a lot of them. And in the box at the top, all those men went to the same school. Now, what happened was this young woman was relocated out of the area for her own safety. And you can guess what happened. The girls in the red at the bottom who were on the peripheries just moved up and filled her space. Now, one arrest was made of those males as well. What is so shocking about this map, apart from the amount of people involved in the crimes committed, all this information was on that girl in the middle's case notes. She'd given all this information to the authorities, and none of it had been pulled together or acted on. So she'd been removed. Never really the answer, is it? But anyway, she'd been removed. One person supposedly protected, but all these offenders carried on offending, and all these other young people were still being harmed. And again, it's just reiterating the need to take a broader approach, not just that individualised approach, if it's not all just to be a chocolate fire guard. And I think that's really important to remember. Now, it's interesting, and again, I really commend this to the Contextual Safeguarding Network. I've done a load of podcasts with young people, absolutely, just great, really interesting about what they think about contextual safeguarding. And it's interesting, I was re-listening to it this morning, because we talk about listening to young people and then acting on what they say, but what happens when they disagree with us? And young people were being spoken to about peer mapping, interestingly, and quite a lot of them weren't keen on it at all. And they were saying that adults don't understand peer groups dynamics. They found it to be quite interfering, detrimental. It made them feel like they were being watched. They thought friends would have better insight into the peer group dynamics than adults would. Adults might misrepresent those dynamics, not understand them. Really interesting to hear what they thought of peer group mapping when we're kind of going on about it and saying how important it is. So it has to be done quite sensitively, I think, and uphold their rights. There's issues around confidentiality and all sorts of things that the Contextual Safeguarding Network have had to consult with. The Contextual Safeguarding Network are currently writing up the emerging findings of their research with young people. And interestingly, what they found is young people were worried about the impact on their parents if services were intervening around extrafamilial harm. They were worried about their parents' reaction. I don't think this is too much of a surprise to us, but they were very worried about it. They were worried about their parents being judged and blamed by children's social care as well, stigma, shame and blame. But really what came across in these podcasts was that young people wanted their parents to be supported by services. And we found this at Pace. It's really interesting. Young people who are being exploited in horrendous ways are happy for their parent to have Pace involved because they know we're neutral. And they often will tell their parents stuff, knowing the parent will tell us. But there's that trust again, because we're a voluntary service. It's really interesting. They don't resent that very often. So yeah, it's really interesting about how young people view contextual safeguarding, and very important that we get their views on it. So do have a look at those podcasts. As I say, I put the link let me put it back here. Yeah, there's the link at the bottom there. It's on Spotify, and you can have a look at those findings from the research. And again, look out for it because it's going to be written up. And actually, the Contextual Safeguarding Network at the moment are doing podcasts with some of the parents that we support. So you'll get that other layer, that other perspective on the views of contextual safeguarding as well. So finally, bit of a race through, isn't it? But I just want to end on talking about the importance of language. So again, very topical. The report yesterday spoke about how still case notes is often littered with victim blaming language, and this has been so problematic over the years. So I just put a few words and phrases up there, and I just want to comment on a couple of them. It's the Contextual Safeguarding Network and PACE, and I'm sure you do all too, totally advocate for the use of language that is not victim blaming, but rather language that puts offenders at the centre of the sentence. So there's several reasons for this. Firstly, I was talking to a police officer the other day who's investigating the alleged rape of a 12-year-old, and the barristers will go back through case notes for years, and they've got case notes from when she was an 8-year-old child at school, and the language in those case notes often refers to her as a liar and a fantasist, and the defence barristers are taking that and using it to get the guy off she's accused of raping her. And these case notes can be used for years to come, and if they're littered with language that is basically accusing the child of lying or not being reliable, it can be incredibly damaging. More than that, children and young people and parents can read these case notes. We know that young people often internalise self-blame. Offenders blame them. Why did you come back to me, etc., etc. And we don't want to do anything that compounds that self-blame, that compounds that self-guilt. But probably the most classic ones that we still come across a lot, and I know Carleen Furman does as well in her research, is that phrase, she puts herself at risk, he makes himself vulnerable. So what the Contextual Safeguarding Network say is always situate the blame with the offender, not the behaviour of the child. So always say she is being put at risk by so-and-so. He is being made vulnerable by so-and-so. Always put the blame on the offender at the centre of the sentence. The classic one, of course, is will not engage. They won't engage with us. Parents won't engage. Child won't engage with us. And again, what the Contextual Safeguarding Network say to this is, it's not up to young people to engage with us. It's our job to get them to engage with us. And it may be it's not safe for them to engage with us. It may be that, you know if they engage with services, they're being watched, or their families are going to get attacked, or whatever. And so what, again, the Contextual Safeguarding Network always encourage people to say is, I was unable to engage them. So we don't put the blame on the offender or the young person, we put it on ourselves as a professional. At this stage, I was unable to engage them for this reason, that reason. Maybe I'm not the right person. Maybe there's someone else who's better able to engage them, and so on. Maybe I turn up at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Monday when they've been missing for 48 hours. But always the blame is shifted away from the child. And, it's hard, especially if you've got people above you. I found this in the past, managers or whoever, not at PACE, I hasten to add, who use phrases like, oh, they keep putting themselves at risk, they keep making themselves vulnerable, they keep going back, engaging in risky behaviour. It's hard to challenge it, especially if it's people above you, but you can change, not you, but we can change our own language when we're talking in these contexts. So just to summarise, I know it's been a lot of information and you're probably longing for a coffee. So what at PACE we advocate for is working with parents as partners, combine the relational safeguarding model and the contextual safeguarding approach. Do join the Contextual Safeguarding Network. Masses of information, research, podcasts, really accessible, really interesting. Keep up to date with what's going on because there's lots coming out in the next few months. And if you have parents who you think would benefit from PACE support, please get in touch. If you think, do you know what, I just want to get some advice about this, that or the other, or I'd like to access training or whatever, just do look at our website. We'd be more than happy to have contact with you. I hope that's been useful, and I hope, as I stated at the beginning, that in some small way I've kind of enthused you about what a hopeful approach this is. And thank you so much for listening.
Sarah, can I encourage you people just to take yourselves off mic and give her a round of applause, because I hate it in the virtual world that we can't do this. That was absolutely excellent. Thank you. and the intertwining with the relational safeguarding model. So brilliant. We got tight for time, but one question has come up from Martin Webster. Sarah, with lots of youth and community services closing, what do you think the impact has been, rehome away from home? And as the world has changed, young people accessing more much online, how does traditional youth and community work have a positive impact? So how, with the change, how do we still have a community positive impact with things moving into different virtual playgrounds?
Oh, it's so challenging, isn't it? I could weep at what's happened to youth services over the years. And I know it's been such a period of change. I know where I live in Kirklees, we've had a real increase in detached youth work during COVID because they were meeting young people in outdoor spaces. I know there's a big movement to try and do youth work online. And I think there's a lot of beeping going on, which is lovely to see your comments. I missed a bit of the question, but needless to say, youth work again and again and again is just proven to be absolutely central to working with young people. And you know, I can't help but thinking every time I see a murder of a young person from stabbing and in London and other areas, and they're 15, 16, I'm thinking, oh, what a difference could it have made if there'd been youth workers who were just engaging with them and, you know, having those reachable moments and all the rest of it. So I'm going rambling. I missed the second half of your question, but I think there's a real shift in thinking around youth work and how it can be done in this virtual world. But maybe I'm just getting old, but I just think you can't beat that one-to-one contact with a young person, you know, listening to them, big ears, small mouth, all that, and just engaging with them, caring about them. But yeah, but I'll answer more if you like. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. It's actually more comments and reflections coming through, but I think because just of time, we kind of need to give people a break. But Debbie Graham summed it up really lovely. Brilliant presentation, thank you. Your enthusiasm for positive change is infectious. I got a little tingle there, Sarah, actually, and that's true. Because that's right, isn't it? Sarah, thank you so much. Please take time, Sarah, to read the comments in the chat because there's some lovely reflections there and for you to see what's happening already within Darlington. So thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Everybody else, would you like to take yourself 10 minutes break? We'll come back. We'll give you 10 minutes because you've been sat there. So we'll come back at 10:45. Could I have